In the summer of 1153, a Norse earl besieged a tower. His name was Harald Maddadsson, and he ruled Orkney and Shetland. Inside sat a man named Erlend, who had run off with the earl's own mother. The tower stood on a bare little island called Mousa, and Harald had it surrounded. By every rule of medieval warfare, the people inside never stood a chance. Except the siege failed. The saga's verdict sounds almost embarrassed. Mousa was an unhandy place to attack. This tower was not a castle. It had no moat, no garrison, and no lord. It was already more than 1,000 years old, and nobody alive knew who had built it. Tonight we take that tower apart stone by stone. What a broch is, how you raise one out of loose stone with no mortar and no crane, what the diggers found on its floors, and how it beat a medieval army with nobody defending it but a runaway couple. Start with the thing itself, because most people outside Scotland have never heard the word. A broch is a round, hollow, windowless tower of dry stone, shaped like a modern power station cooling tower, wide at the base and curving gently inward as it rises. The best preserved one, the tower on Mousa in Shetland, still stands over 40 feet tall. Two more, at Dun Telve and Dun Trodan in a single mainland glen, still stand tens of feet tall. Ruined stumps of them are everywhere in the north, on sea cliffs beside lochs, guarding narrow glens. Dun Carlaway on the Isle of Lewis still shows its double wall cracked open like a diagram. Caithness, in the far northeast, is so thick with them that you are rarely more than a few miles from one. Stand on a headland there, and you can sometimes see the ruined stumps of 2 or 3 at once, spaced out along the coast like watchtowers on a wall that nobody now remembers building. Archaeologists count at least 500 broch sites across northern and western Scotland and the islands. Line that up against what people usually believe about prehistoric Britain. We imagine mud huts and standing stones, and meanwhile the far north of Scotland was raising hundreds of engineered stone towers while Rome was still a republic. And that is the full map. Not one broch in England, not one in Ireland, not one anywhere else on the planet. This is a building type invented, perfected, and abandoned inside one corner of one country, in the centuries on either side of the birth of Christ. The people who built them left no writing, so we do not have their name for themselves, let alone for their towers. The word broch came later, from Norse settlers, whose word borg meant a fort or stronghold. Which tells you what the Vikings assumed when they sailed past these things. It is the same thing you would assume. Everyone did. Keep that assumption in mind, because this story is going to take it away from you. But first the towers themselves, because before you can argue about what a broch was for, you have to answer a harder question. How is it still standing? A modern concrete apartment tower gets a design life of about 50 to 100 years, with engineers, inspections, and repair budgets attached. Mousa has stood on a storm-hammered island in the North Sea for roughly 2,000 years, unmaintained, and it has not fallen down. There is not a gram of mortar in it. Every stone is held by nothing but the stones around it. The tallest prehistoric structure still standing in northern Europe is, technically, a loose pile of rocks. Say that out loud, and it sounds like a joke. 2,000 winters say otherwise. The same Atlantic winters that strip slates off modern houses across Shetland year after year, while the loose pile of rocks just keeps standing. A loose pile of rocks has a serious problem with height, and the builders knew it. Stack a plain dry stone wall too tall, and the base starts to shrug under the weight. Stones creep, the wall bellies out, and one hard winter brings it down. The first part of the answer was the shape. A broch is a perfect circle, and a circle has no corners, and corners are where walls die. Every stone in a curved wall is braced by its neighbours on either side, so the whole ring squeezes itself tight, the way an arch does, all the way around at every course. Wind that would pry at a flat gable slides around a drum. The plan of a broch is not a style, it is a structural decision. But a circle alone does not get you to 40 feet, because the real enemy is weight. Make the wall solid and thick enough to be stable at that height, and you are hauling a mountain of stone, and the sheer dead load starts working against you. The broch builder's answer to that is the single cleverest thing about these towers, and you cannot see it from outside. The wall is hollow. From the ground up, a broch is really two towers, a complete inner skin and a complete outer skin, rising together with a gap of air between them. Less stone, less weight, less crushing load at the base, from a wall that is still, functionally, 6 or more feet deep against anything trying to get in. Two thin skins, though, should be weaker than one thick wall, not stronger. Left alone, each skin would buckle like a tall garden wall. So the builders tied them together. Every few feet of height, long flat slabs were laid across the gap, bonding inner and outer skin into a single structure, and those rows of slabs turned the space between the skins into something extraordinary. Stacked galleries, circling the tower, one above another, all the way up. Engineers who study brochs point out how modern that logic is. A hollow shell, braced internally, strong precisely because of what is not there. We build box girder bridges and aircraft on the same principle. They got there first, in fieldstone, without a written number anywhere in sight. The dry joints themselves were doing quiet work too. A tower on a Scottish coast takes salt gales broadside all winter, and it sits on ground that shifts with frost. A rigid sealed wall fights that movement and eventually cracks. A dry stone wall does not fight it at all. Every joint can flex a hair and settle back, and rain that blows into the face of the wall drains straight down through it and out, instead of pooling inside to freeze and pry. Where a bonded wall stores up its damage, a broch wall sheds it, storm after storm, century after century. The builders never saw a frost heave calculation in their lives. They just built a wall with 10,000 tiny joints and let the wall do the flexing. And the hollow wall quietly solved another problem, the one that stumps most people when they stand in front of Mousa. How did they build this high with no scaffolding? The answer is that the tower is its own scaffolding. Inside the wall, a stone staircase winds upward between the skins, from gallery to gallery. As the courses rose, the builders climbed their own wall, hauling stone up through the structure they had just finished, working from inside the widening rings. When the last course was laid, the construction platform did not come down. It simply became the building. At the bottom, the tower touches the ground with deliberate caution. The lowest courses are solid, the wall at its thickest, the whole drum leaning slightly inward as it climbs, so gravity pulls every course toward the centre of the ring instead of off the edge. And the openings, the weak points every wall dreads, barely exist. No windows at all. One door, a single low, narrow passage at ground level, so tight that a grown adult has to stoop and shuffle through it, past checks in the stone where a heavy wooden door once sat, barred from inside, sometimes watched from a tiny guard cell built into the passage wall. Hold on to that ground-level door. It looks like a small design detail. It is quietly going to flip this entire story on its head. Step through that door while we are here, because the inside of a broch is not what the outside advertises. The passage is black and tight, and then the tower opens above you, a round stone room maybe 30 feet across, rising into shadow. Partway up the inner wall runs a ledge, a scarcement, built to carry the joists of a timber upper floor. Below, the ground level, with its hearth smoke and its animal warmth in winter. Above, a raised wooden gallery where people slept and worked, up out of the damp, lit by the fire below. Whether the towers carried a full roof, and how high is still argued, because the timber is long gone, and the far north has few trees to spare, but the picture the interior paints is unmistakable once you stand in it. Smoke, grain, wool, animals, children on a wooden floor above the byre. Keep that picture. It is about to matter. Because from the outside, everything reads exactly the way the Vikings read it. Windowless, one defensible entrance, walls 6 feet thick, a guard cell for a guard. For 2 centuries, that was the confident answer. Brochs were forts, castles before castles, refugees from raiders. Then archaeologists started excavating the floors instead of admiring the walls, and it turns out the war machine was furnished like a farmhouse. Querns for grinding grain in almost every broch that has been properly dug. Loom weights and spindle whorls. Cooking pots, hearths, butchered animal bone, byres and barns clustered around the entrances, ledges partway up the inner wall that once carried a timber upper floor. A warm sleeping loft above the animals and the smoke. No weapon hoards. No barracks. No sign of standing garrisons at all. And most brochs have another problem if you try to read them as fortresses. A few have wells or cisterns, but most have no water supply inside at all. A defender behind that barred door could hold out only as long as thirst allowed, which means a broch could not survive the one thing real fortresses are built to survive, a patient enemy. The mightiest towers of prehistoric Britain were, on the everyday evidence, houses. Somebody lived in the vault. So what was the threat, if not armies? Iron Age Scotland had no cities to sack and no legions to repel. What it had was neighbours. Wealth in that world walked on 4 legs, and cattle raiding was close to a seasonal sport, a way young men built reputations. The sea brought worse. Some archaeologists argue that as Rome's frontier crept up Britain, the far north felt a new kind of pressure, raiders feeding captives into the slave markets of the empire's edge. That last part is a theory, argued over exactly like everything else about brochs. But the general picture is not in doubt. This was a landscape where trouble arrived fast, took what it could carry, and left before anyone organised a response. Read the tower against that threat, and the modern picture snaps into focus. It looks less like a castle and more like an arms race between neighbours in a place where safety and reputation were the same possession. A broch answered both at once. Its walls genuinely worked against the real danger, which was never a siege. A raid is a fast crime. Against an hour of violence, a barred stone tube with your family, your grain, and your best animals inside is a nearly perfect answer. The raiders' one advantage was speed, and the broch took speed off the table. And on every other day of the year, the tower did its second job just by standing there. You could see a broch from miles away. Whoever raised one was announcing, permanently, in 10,000 hand-laid stones, that their family commanded the labour, the skill, and the standing to build the biggest thing anyone in that glen would ever see. Part refuge, part declaration. A safe that was also a mansion, which is a very human thing to build. And there is a version of that impulse you can still act on, because making something permanent with your own hands did not end with the Iron Age. If this makes you want to put your own hands on the past instead of just watching it, that is the whole idea behind the Medieval Way store. It starts with the Medieval Bakery Collection, the practical recipes book for the dishes themselves, the sourdough manual for keeping a living leaven the old way, and the sourcing guide for finding real heritage grain. The bread is where this kitchen begins. The strange thing is how quickly the builders themselves walked away. Around a century or two after Christ, broch building simply stopped. Nobody knows exactly why, and the honest answer is that we probably never will, because the only witnesses never wrote anything down. What the ground shows is this: power in the north was shifting, Fashions in status were changing, and some brochs were partly dismantled by their own communities, their stone recycled into humbler roundhouses and wheelhouses built in and around the old towers, sometimes right inside the shell. The people stayed. The point of the towers faded. A family in the year 400 was cooking its dinner in a snug stone house whose back wall was the stump of a monument their ancestors had raised, the way we might live in a converted church without thinking much about it. Within a few generations, the north of Scotland was a landscape of working farms crouched beside enormous silent giants that nobody needed anymore. And that should have been the end of the story. 1,000 years of wind, rain and salt should have finished what the dismantlers started. Instead, the towers got a second life, and this is where the sagas walk in. Shetland, around the year 900. A Norwegian named Björn was running for Iceland with Thora, a woman he had taken against her family's wishes, when the sea threw their ship onto Shetland. The couple wintered inside the old tower on Mousa, in a building that was already 1,000 years old, abandoned since before the fall of Rome. It still kept out a Shetland winter. They married in it, waited out the storms, and sailed on in the spring. The saga does not marvel at any of this. It treats the tower as a simple fact of the landscape, a stone shelter that had always been there and always would be, the way you might mention sheltering in a cave. 1,000-year-old building had become geology. That was only round one. 2.5 centuries later came the siege we started with. In 1153, Erlend the Young wanted Margaret, the widowed mother of Earl Harald Maddadsson, and the Earl said no. So Erlend took her to Mousa anyway, barred the ancient door, and waited. Harald arrived with his ships, looked at a 1,200-year-old farm tower, and found himself in the same position as every cattle raider since before Rome. The door was low, narrow, and barred. The walls were 6 feet of stone with no purchase for fire. Starving them out meant a long, humiliating camp on a bare island, while the rest of his earldom wondered where he was. Think through his options the way he had to. Fire, the great door-opener of medieval raiding, had nothing to eat. You cannot burn a solid stone wall, and the one wooden thing in reach, the barred door, sat at the end of a passage where one defender could hold off a line of men crawling in on their knees. Undermining meant weeks. Assault meant feeding his warriors one by one into a stone throat. The saga says he judged it an unhandy place to attack and settled. Erlend got the marriage. The Broch got its last recorded victory, more than a millennium after its builders died, defended by a honeymoon couple. And no, I am not making that up. It is in the Orkney saga, written down within living memory of the men involved. Stand back from that and look at the scorecard. A building raised by people whose names are gone, out of loose stone, with no binder, no plans, and no machines, was still weatherproof after 1,000 years and still militarily awkward after 1,200. Nothing we are building today is expected to do that. The Broch builders never wrote down a word, but they left a kind of signature, an engineering argument that a wall can be strongest where it is empty, laid out 500 times across the top of Scotland, and the craft behind it never quite died. Dry stone wallers still work across Scotland and far beyond, and in 2018 the art of building with unbound stone was added to UNESCO's list of the world's intangible cultural heritage. The people are anonymous. The knowledge got a name. Today Mousa is uninhabited by people, and very much inhabited otherwise. Thousands of storm petrels, small seabirds that come ashore only in darkness, nest in the gaps of the Broch's dry stone wall, deep in the galleries where the builders once climbed. The tower stands open to the sky, still over 40 feet tall, still without a gram of mortar, still doing what it has done for 2,000 years. Holding. Subscribe to Medieval Way for more buildings that outlived their builders. Which impressed you more, the hollow wall or the barred door? Tell me below. Build to last.